65%. That's how much of the world's refined silver supply is now under the direct control of the Chinese government, not through market forces, not through competitive advantage, through a licensing system that went into effect on January 1st, 2026, and changed everything. The official explanation from Beijing's Ministry of Commerce was environmental protection and resource conservation. Standard bureaucratic language designed to deflect attention. But the numbers tell a different story. The story about strategic control over a metal that powers everything from solar panels to semiconductors, from electric vehicles to guided missiles. And here's what makes this moment different from every other commodity restriction in history. Silver isn't just an industrial metal. It isn't just a precious metal, it's both, and that dual identity is about to create the most severe supply crisis the global economy has seen in decades. The timing wasn't coincidental. On October 30th, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce quietly announced the new export framework. Starting January 1st, 2026, any company wanting to export silver would need to obtain a special government license, not a quota, not a permit, a license that requires meeting two conditions that effectively eliminate 90% of existing export. The first condition, annual production capacity of at least 80 tons. In Western regions, that threshold drops to 40 tons, but the message is clear. Small and medium-sized refiners are out. Only the largest state-approved operations will be allowed to ship silver beyond China's border. The second condition, a consistent export track record from 2022 through 2024. New market entrants need not apply. If you weren't already in the game, you're locked out for the next 2 years. Connect these requirements to China's dominance in global silver refining, and the implications become clear. This isn't regulation, this is consolidation. Beijing is centralizing control over a critical mineral at the exact moment global demand is exploding. But this was only the beginning. To understand why China's move matters, you need to understand the silver market's fundamental problem. For 5 consecutive years, global demand has exceeded total supply, not by small margins, by structural deficits that have quietly drained inventory from every major vault on the planet. In 2024, the deficit reached 148.9 million ounces. That single year, add up the 4 years before it, and you get 678 million ounces of silver that was consumed but never replaced. That's the equivalent of 10 months of global mining production, simply gone. Where did it go? Into solar panels in China, into electric vehicle components in Europe, into semiconductor fabrication plants across Asia, into the industrial machine that powers the modern economy. The Silver Institute, the industry's primary research body, projects 2025 will mark the 5th consecutive year of deficit, and 2026, with China's export restrictions now active, the math becomes even more brutal. Global silver mine production in 2025 reached approximately 820 million ounces. Total demand exceeded 1.24 billion ounces. That's a gap of over 400 million ounces that had to come from somewhere, from vaults, from recycling, from above-ground stockpiles that have been shrinking year after year. The data is clear, the trend is undeniable, and China just made it worse. What came next changed everything. The immediate market reaction was chaos. Silver prices, which had already climbed steadily through late 2025, exploded in the first 2 weeks of January 2026. On January 14th, spot silver touched $93.75 per ounce, an all-time record, more than triple where it traded just 18 months earlier. But the headline price only tells part of the story. The real signal came from the premium markets. In Shanghai, physical silver was trading at price levels that made Western exchanges look like discount stores. The spread between Shanghai physical and COMEX paper widened to levels that shouldn't exist in a functioning market. $8, $10. At some points, the premium exceeded 12%. Traders in Asia were paying substantially more for metal they could hold in their hands than traders in New York were paying for contracts that might never settle in physical form. This divergence isn't a market anomaly, it's a market signal. When physical premiums explode while paper prices lag, it means one thing. The paper market is losing its connection to reality. The contracts being traded in New York and London are promises. The metal being hoarded in Shanghai is certainty. In a world of structural deficits and export restrictions, commands a premium that paper can never match. The pattern becomes clear. China's strategy didn't emerge overnight. It follows a playbook Beijing has used before, most notably with rare earth elements. In the early 2000s, China controlled roughly 90% of global rare earth production. When they began restricting exports in 2010, Prices for some elements increased by over 1,000%. Western manufacturers scrambled, supply chains fractured, and China gained leverage it still holds today. The silver restrictions mirror that approach with one critical difference. Rare earths were primarily strategic materials used in defense and high-tech applications. Silver is everywhere. Every smartphone contains silver. Every solar panel requires it. Every electric vehicle uses it. Every computer, every medical device, every piece of advanced electronics depends on a metal that China now controls. Elon Musk understood immediately. When news of the export restrictions broke, he posted a simple warning on his social media platform. This is not good. Silver is needed in many industrial processes. Coming from the man who runs the world's largest electric vehicle company, those words carry weight. Tesla's supply chain depends on silver for electrical contacts, battery connections, and countless other applications. If Chinese silver becomes harder to obtain, every EV manufacturer on the planet feels the pain, but electric vehicles are just the beginning. The solar industry consumes more silver than any other industrial sector. Photovoltaic cells require silver paste for electrical conductivity, and there's no viable substitute at scale. Global solar installations have grown exponentially over the past decade, driven by government mandates and falling costs. That growth requires silver. Lots of it. In 2024, the solar industry consumed over 150 million ounces of silver. Projections for 2025 and beyond show continued acceleration. India alone is expanding photovoltaic manufacturing capacity at a rate that competes directly with China for available supply. The metal that was once considered abundant is becoming the bottleneck for the entire green energy transition. And that's when things got interesting. The COMEX, the primary futures exchange for precious metals in the United States, has become ground zero for the emerging crisis. Registered silver inventory, the metal actually available for delivery against futures contracts, has collapsed over 70% since The vaults that once held comfortable surpluses now strain to meet delivery demands. In early January 2026, something unusual appeared in the COMEX data. Open interest in the January contract rose by 1,431 contracts on January 7th. At the same time, March open interest fell by nearly 3,000 contracts. The best explanation for this pattern is backward rolling, traders moving positions from longer-dated contracts to earlier ones. In a normal market, rolls go forward. Traders maintain exposure to price movements without taking physical delivery. Backward rolling indicates the opposite. It signals backwardation, immediate scarcity, and traders who want metal now rather than promises for later. John Lindow, a silver market analyst, explained the significance. Backward rolling from March to January means traders are positioning to take immediate delivery. They don't want to wait. They don't trust that metal will be available in March. They want it now, even though January is not typically an active delivery month. The implications are severe. If long positions aggressively stand for delivery, COMEX registered stocks could drain further. If shorts are involved in the roll, they might be trying to avoid delivery demands in March. But that creates its own problems. In a tight supply environment, shifting delivery obligations earlier doesn't solve the fundamental problem. It just moves the pressure point. The dots were connected. While silver markets convulsed, gold was sending its own message. On January 14, 2026, gold touched $4,642.58 per ounce, another all-time record. But the driver wasn't inflation or interest rates. It was something far more destabilizing. The United States Department of Justice had served grand jury subpoenas to the Federal Reserve. Reports indicated that Fed Chair Jerome Powell faced potential criminal indictment related to the cost of renovating Federal Reserve headquarters. The official explanation seemed thin. The real concern ran deeper. Powell's video response cut through the noise. He stated directly that the threat of criminal charges was a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on its best assessment of what serves the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. In other words, the investigation was retaliation for monetary policy independence. More than a dozen global central bankers, including the heads of the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, issued a statement of solidarity with Powell and the Fed. They understood what was at stake. If the world's most important central bank loses its independence, the dollar loses its foundation. Gold's spike to record highs reflected that fear. When institutional confidence in currency stability falters, capital flows to the asset that has served as money for 5,000 years. Central banks themselves have been accumulating gold at unprecedented rates. In 2024,
Net purchases exceeded 1,000 tons for the third consecutive year. Poland, Turkey, Uzbekistan, China, all adding to reserves. According to IMF data compiled by Bloomberg, the market value of gold held by foreign central banks has now overtaken their holdings of U.S. Treasuries. For the first time in decades, central bank gold reserves are valued at close to $4 trillion. The shift is structural, not cyclical. This changes everything. The Federal Reserve's own operations revealed the stress building in the system. On December 31, 2025, banks borrowed $74.6 billion through the Fed's Standing Repo Facility, the largest single-day operation in the program's history, larger than the September 2019 crisis, larger than the March 2020 pandemic response. The official explanation was year-end liquidity management, routine adjustments for regulatory reporting requirements, but the pattern told a different story.
On December 26, the day after Christmas, an unnamed institution had already tapped the facility for $17 billion, emergency funding while most Americans were still unwrapping presents. The borrower's identity remains classified for 2 years under Federal Reserve disclosure rule, and on December 11th, the Fed had quietly removed the $500 billion cap on the Standing Repo Facility. The official language called it operational flexibility, the translation unlimited emergency lending with no ceiling. Connect these three events: unlimited facility on December 11th, secret borrower on December 26th, record injection on December 31st. This isn't housekeeping, this is a pattern. Some analysts dismissed the repo activity as routine, year-end window dressing that would normalize within days, and technically, they were right. By January 2nd, the Standing Repo Facility balance had dropped back to zero. The overnight reverse repo facility, which had spiked to $106 billion on December 31st, fell to just $6 billion. But the speed of that reversal doesn't erase the underlying reality. After 3 years of quantitative tightening that removed $2.43 trillion from the system, liquidity stress is appearing at predictable pressure points. Year-end, quarter-end, month-end, tax day, the Fed's tools are being tested more frequently, and the amounts are growing larger. The signal is undeniable. President Trump's decision on critical minerals tariffs added another layer of complexity. After months of speculation that silver and other strategic metals would face import duties, Trump announced on January 14th that he would hold off on tariffs. Instead, he ordered negotiations with trading partners to secure adequate supplies and floated the idea of price floors for critical minerals. The decision temporarily removed a price driver that had fueled silver's record run. Fears of tariffs had kept massive amounts of metal in U.S. warehouses, contributing to the global short squeeze that began in October. According to Bloomberg data, about 434 million ounces of silver now sit in COMEX-linked warehouses in New York, roughly 100 million more than a year earlier. Silver prices dropped 7% on the announcement, falling from the $93 peak to as low as $86 before recovering to around $90. But analysts noted that the underlying fundamentals hadn't changed. China's export restrictions were still in effect. The structural deficit continued. The tariff threat was deferred, not eliminated. Daniel Ghaly at TD Securities called Trump's approach more surgical, suggesting the administration would be selective rather than sweeping in future decisions. But selective still means uncertain. And uncertainty in a tight physical market creates its own volatility. The real story was just starting. Japan provided the clearest evidence of what happens when physical silver becomes scarce. Reports emerged of premiums in Tokyo reaching $130 per ounce, while COMEX paper traded at $72, an 80% premium for physical metal over paper contracts. That spread cannot persist in a rational market. Either physical prices fall or paper prices rise. Given the structural deficit, the export restrictions, and the industrial demand that shows no sign of slowing, the direction seems clear. Paper will eventually have to acknowledge what physical already knows. The World Gold Council's survey of central banks found that 95% expect to increase gold reserves over the next 12 months. That sentiment extends to silver among those institutions that hold it. When the official sector is accumulating rather than selling, retail and institutional investors take notice. JP Morgan's research team projects gold reaching $5,000 per ounce by the fourth quarter. Their model suggests around 585 tons of quarterly investor and central bank demand, comprising 190 tons from central banks, 330 tons in bar and coin demand, and 275 tons from ETFs and futures. If gold reaches those levels, silver's historical ratio suggests prices far above current records.
The gold to silver ratio has averaged around 60 to 1 over the past century. At $5,000 gold, that ratio would imply silver above $80 even in normal conditions. In a supply crisis, ratios compress. The 1980 peak saw the ratio collapse to 17 to 1. The math doesn't lie. China's strategic calculus extends beyond silver. The export restrictions on silver accompany parallel controls on tungsten, antimony, and rare earth elements.
Beijing is systematically tightening its grip on the materials that power modern technology and green energy infrastructure. The licensing framework allows for graduated escalation, from reduced quotas to complete prohibitions depending on geopolitical circumstances. This mirrors the rare earth playbook, where controls tightened incrementally over years, enabling strategic adjustments without immediate disruption. Western nations are responding, but slowly. The United States added silver to its critical minerals list in November 2025, acknowledging what markets already knew. Domestic mining capacity is insufficient. Recycling cannot close the gap. Stockpiling is expensive and creates its own distortion. The International Energy Agency has warned that current mineral supply chains cannot support the pace of energy transition that governments have mandated. Solar installations, wind turbines, electric vehicles, grid storage, all require metals that are becoming harder to obtain. Silver sits at the intersection of these trends. Some analysts project annual deficits exceeding 5,000 metric tons if Chinese exports drop by 50%. At current consumption rates, some industrial regions have barely 30 to 45 days of accessible silver reserve. That's not a buffer, that's a crisis waiting to happen. But this wasn't the final move. The silver market of January 2026 represents a structural break from the past. For decades, paper markets set prices and physical markets followed. Futures contracts determined value, and miners, refiners, and industrial users aligned their operations accordingly. That relationship is inverting. Physical scarcity is now driving prices, and paper markets are struggling to keep pace. The disconnect between Shanghai physical and COMEX futures isn't a temporary arbitrage opportunity. It's the market signaling that the old system is breaking. Investment demand has surged alongside industrial consumption. The iShares Silver Trust, the largest silver-backed ETF, reached a record value above $47.5 billion in mid-January, representing almost 30% of the giant SPDR Gold Trust. Retail investors see what's happening and want exposure before prices climb further. But ETF shares are not physical metal. They're claims on metal held in vaults, and those vaults are draining. When physical inventory drops below the level needed to back outstanding shares, the premium over net asset value expands. Some Chinese silver funds have already had to turn away new investors, worried about exactly this dynamic. The premium expansion becomes self-reinforcing. As investors pay more for ETF shares, the perceived scarcity intensifies. More buying follows, premiums widen further, and the gap between paper and physical grows. The weight stays with you. What happens next depends on variables that no model can fully capture. Will China enforce its export restrictions strictly, or will exceptions emerge for favored trading partners? Will Western nations accelerate domestic mining and recycling, or will permitting delays and environmental opposition slow the response? Will industrial users find substitutes for silver in critical applications, or will the unique properties of the metal prove irreplaceable? The honest answer is uncertainty. Silver has reached $93.75, a level that seemed impossible just 2 years ago. It could reach $100 before March if physical tightness intensifies. It could also pull back sharply if profit-taking overwhelms the structural bid. But the underlying fundamentals don't change with price swings. The deficit continues, the export restrictions remain, the industrial demand accelerates, and the vaults keep draining. Central banks are voting with their reserves, accumulating gold and reconsidering their exposure to dollar-denominated assets. Sophisticated investors are taking delivery rather than rolling contracts. Industrial users are scrambling to secure supply before the next squeeze. The silver market isn't just changing, it's revealing something about the global economy that most analysts have ignored. The resources required for the energy transition are finite. The supply chains that deliver them are fragile, and the nations that control them are learning to use that control as leverage. China understood this before anyone else. The export restrictions on silver are not an isolated policy decision. They're a signal about how Beijing views the strategic landscape. In a world of competing great powers, control over critical minerals is control over the future. The West is waking up to this reality, but slowly. Mining permits take years, refining capacity takes long, and the structural deficits in silver have been building for half a decade, while markets look the other way. Now the math is catching up. The vaults are draining,
The premiums are widening. The paper promises are being tested against the hard limits of geology and geopolitics. This story isn't over. The data will continue to emerge. The prices will continue to move, and the implications will continue to ripple through every industry that depends on a metal. The world suddenly realizes it cannot live without. Watch the COMEX registered inventory. Watch the Shanghai premiums. Watch the central bank reserve reports. The signals are there for anyone willing to look. 65% of global silver supply is now under Beijing's control. What happens next will be determined by how the world responds to a reality it should have seen coming years ago. The clock is ticking, the vaults are emptying, and the game has changed.